Good morning, everyone. We're here to talk about points of vulnerability, rare earths, semiconductors, and energy. A few housekeeping notes. The audience can submit questions through ask.ac.org. There are mics in the room for in-person questions, and all that is between you and your coffee break is the four of us. Let's get started. I think we should do a little bit of setting the landscape of where we're at on this topic. In the past 5 years, we've seen some pretty deep vulnerabilities in critical supply chains. COVID, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, just to name two. They're testing the capacity of both the public and private sectors to respond. Jonathan, I'm going to bring you in here. And everyone, please look at their bios, Jonathan, Eddie, and Mark. They're very interesting people. Jonathan, tell us, what are some lessons from these recent crises that you can share with us?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here, and to Atlantic Council and Atlantic Brücke for this really interesting day and the conversation that's already been very interesting, very interesting indeed. And I'm glad in your question that you brought in COVID as well as Russia and China and some of these other things, because I think the thread through what we have seen there, and it's sort of probably obvious to a room like this, is that in a world where we have a much more globally integrated economy, which is the arena for both geopolitical competition, but actually also for a whole load of wider risks, at the very least, we need to be more on top of and have a better grip of the supply chains that are critical to us. And that became very clear, of course, most obviously in bits of COVID, and the work people like you have gone on to look at other areas as well. I think for us as people who are involved in the policy making side, we have definitely been on a journey over that time as we've sort of caught up, if you like, with the reality of that. And I think something that we're trying to do in the British government to be clear about is to be clear that we're actually trying to address a number of different things that I think can be complementary but aren't always. And I think there's three. One is areas where there is a direct national security risk sitting in some of our supply chains, and where in a world where dual use is a much more grey concept, that's one area. The other one, which is actually much more a sort of COVID-related thing, is about dependency on single suppliers, and some of the lessons actually came back that from Fukushima indeed as well. So that's a thing there that can overlap with the national security questions, but it's not always the same. And then the other one that is linked to it, but I think hasn't had enough attention, at least in some of our sort of debate, is countries' desires to look at their own industrial base, at their own labour market, and the opportunities for people in their own countries, and things like whether it's the last American administration's sort of efforts on the IRA and subsidy, whether it's tariffs, whether it's export controls, all three of those sorts of tools are actually trying to deal with all three of those things at the same time, and that's I think the sort of big policy challenge for us.
So we've heard from you on the government perspective. Eddie, we're seeing countries take steps to reduce dependencies. And we're at the same time, that is bringing on warnings of economic fragmentation. Can you talk us through how you see the efforts to secure strategic supply chains intersecting with these concerns of economic fragmentation?
Sure. And Jonathan, I appreciate you aiming to sort of bring rigor to this discussion around de-risking, because sometimes we talk about terms like economic security, or in the last administration, small yard, high fence, but we don't actually define what we're trying to insulate against. The one thing I might add, and I don't know if this is maybe subsumed under one of the three categories, is that there's also this categories that I would call choke points, where there's sectors of the global economy where one country has a dominant position and there are few, if any, substitutes. And one of the characteristics of these choke points is that the countries that possess them can weaponize them and impose asymmetric harm on others. So typically, in the US at least, when we've thought about critical sectors, it's really been about areas where we need to produce a specific product for national security reasons, because it goes into ammunition. But there are also sectors where China can just use that sector to impose economic pressure on us, basically the same way that the United States has used the dollar as a key choke point for economic sanctions. We saw that vividly this past spring when it came to rare earth minerals. Something that has not been said so far in this conversation this morning is that the reason that the US actually did back away from the tariffs in the spring was because China established escalation dominance over the United States by cutting off US's access to rare earth minerals. We cannot, as the United States, have that kind of vulnerability. And the way to rectify it is through industrial policy. The Trump administration, I laud them, has tried to take a very bold move when it comes to rare earth minerals by acquiring 15% of a company called MP Materials in the United States. It's probably the most ambitious strategy that any presidency has done to really try to fix this problem. But at the same time, the proof is going to be in the pudding. And it's going to take years to see whether or not we actually can reduce that dependency that proved so decisive earlier this year.
Do you think that we can get to a point of resilience without undermining global market access or even innovation?
To me, the key really comes down to, is this all about onshoring? Are we only going to feel secure economically if we do everything ourselves? Or do we get comfortable with the concept of friendshoring? I think if the goal is onshoring for every single critical sector, we're going to be disappointed because it's going to take too long, it's going to be too expensive, and many of these projects won't work, right? I mean, the criticism of the MP Materials deal is that you make a big bet on a single company, right? Well, what if that doesn't pan out? I'd rather have a portfolio of potential options to fix that choke point. And one of them could be in the US, but maybe another one could be in Great Britain or in Germany. I as an American, feel comfortable relying on allies for critical supply chains, but less so when China is the one holding that choke point.
David, you're bringing us some industry expertise from Merck Electronics. Across sectors like batteries, advanced batteries, and life sciences, there's vertical integration. Let's talk about this. It's become a strategy to strengthen the supply chain and reduce exposure to single points of failure. But that process, full integration, requires coordinated action across business, finance, and policy. How are you approaching that challenge?
I mean, I'm talking here about, or I'm representing more the semiconductor business of Merck, and their vertical integration is a very difficult thing. It's basically not practical. I mean, there are two things you need to consider. We are talking a lot about multi-sourcing, about different ways to react to either geopolitical or even nature catastrophes. And if you would try to vertically integrate, that would mean that you're locked in on a certain value chain. You can't get all of them basically into your portfolio. So this is more done with strong partnerships, with increased local-to-local strategies. That is what works better in this industry because you can't just replicate all that specialized know-how, all these learning curves which had been learned quickly by just buying or integrating these chains. But what we do and what is very important is that we vertically integrate in terms of capabilities. So that doesn't mean owning the thing, but understanding or having a grip to these things as the value chain, especially in semi, is getting broader and broader. And in order to truly understand the problems of your customer, you need to open up and you need to look to the left and the right in order to understand what really drives them. So this is happening at our company by, for instance, integrating more process control capabilities, or we acquired a company directly in the Silicon Valley where we have more the fab type tools, so we better understand this lab to fab transition. So these things are happening and they're vital in order to better really serve your customers.
Merck has found itself right in the center of the trade tensions. The most recent, or one of the most recent tariff escalations between the US and EU are multinationals operating in strategic sectors like pharma. As of now, and I haven't checked the latest if there's been any new developments in the last 15 hours, but medicines are subject to a blanket of 15% tariff rate. But Trump has launched a Section 232 probe into national security implications of relying on foreign production, which could lead to tariffs in the pharma sector. David, how are those shifting tariff dynamics hitting the long-term planning and operational resilience that you were facing?
Yeah, obviously it makes it very complicated because I think one big disadvantage, and you said it basically about tariffs, is that you exclude friendshoring. I mean, you hit your allies with these tariffs, and especially, in semiconductors, there are better ways to boost the system if you want so. I mean, like export controls, dedicated subsidies, while the tariffs are very broad and they actually hit, if you talk about a semiconductor value chain, they hit several times. So this compounds in terms of a penalty, which in the end it will be transferred into costs. Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about what you think are the most pressing challenges as you're dealing with the volatility?
Well, I think obviously in your book you were more looking at the macroeconomic tensions, and we have the semiconductor industry as probably the most globalized industry in the world. And let me really just briefly explain you what is actually happening, because that is increasing. And the reason is that normally we used to look at the semiconductor industry on a small sector, which is basically Moore's law, the little transistors, improving them. But this industry changed radically. So now we look at the whole system. A company like NVIDIA or AMD or whatever, they start at the AI, at the algorithm. Then they look, what do I need in terms of a system? If you look at these AI accelerators, they are not chips. They are cities of chips, very carefully orchestrated. Then you look at which chips do I need? How do I interconnect them? How do I package them? And then it goes down to the chip design and to the transistor. So everything influences everything, and everything co-optimizes everything. So the need for the value chain to talk to each other, and that's why you hear that word collaboration that often. 5-10 years ago, you didn't hear that much, is because you need to align these things perfectly. It's really like we started to train a virtuoso to play some things very well, and now it turns into a symphony orchestra, which doesn't even have a conductor. It's more or less these performance per watt or performance per dollar things which are conducting this. So, and this is increasing. If you think about, now we're getting more optics into the game, co-packaged optics, and we're getting bioconvergence, very interesting topic with lab on chip, organ on a chip, these things. We're getting quantum computing, which needs to be integrated into that system, neuromorphic and all these things. So it's going to increase. So this industry, in order to innovate on these things, will even more need that globalized context. So if you start to defragment it, you're going to hurt, let's say, the efficiency of that innovation. So it's not only the manufacturability, it's also the innovation part.
Now we have a lot of policymakers in the room and watching this virtually. If there was something that they could do to support the terrain that you're navigating, what would that be?
I mean, we need consistency, and we need something which is predictable. Yeah? We need, I believe, if you have these geopolitical tension and blocks, you need to play them smart. You need to find your allies, you need to align them perfectly and to really play it smart. And that means, we talk about choke points, you can also talk about strengths. Each region has its strengths. It's about strengths and their strengths in order to have a seat at the table if you then negotiate the deals, be it with China or other players. So we need that consistency, we need that long-term strategic move so we can, there's enough transition time so the industry can adapt, but you can also optimize for that. And to be fair, also build out your competitive advantage. Yeah.
Jonathan, you were recently the UK's G7 Sherpa, a role that you stepped back from in February. You helped shape international responses to systemic risks from energy security to industrial resilience. When you see allies broadly agree on the need to de-risk critical supply chains, but you're also seeing that national approaches are diverging on implementation, particularly around subsidies, industrial policies, and technology partnerships. How do you deal with those two competing forces?
Well, if you sort of step back on this, you've got a sort of interesting dynamic, which is that at least for countries like the UK and Germany and the US, we are market economies, and we are in competition with each other as well, and our companies are competing with each other. And that is right, and you still want to encourage that. And then at the same time, you've got a set of areas where you need to strategically cooperate and collaborate. Now, managing actually that managing that dynamic is not a straightforward thing to do in policy making. We've tried over the recent years to use things like the G7 as a forum for that, and I would say sort of two things on it. It's inevitably quite a sort of messy and complicated picture, but this is not sort of unique to any other area. If you think about financial regulation, you've got a set of global standards or wider standards that you get in you get through sort of Basel, etc. But then every country has its own approach to its own regulation, and you have a financial regulator. And I think you're seeing the same thing on sort of tech, and you see the same thing here. So it's not a new thing, but the bit that's more complicated, say, is managing that sort of strategic tension between competition and cooperation. The way we try to do that in the sort of G7 format is to sort of build on areas where you actually want to sort of have a proper dialogue about how you're implementing your measures. So that's included on things like investment security, both inbound and outbound, included on things about how we do our approach to things like export controls, and then on areas where actually the coordination was very active on things like sanctions when it came to Russia. So there's nothing, you can't really go beyond, I think, that sort of mixed picture. I think the other thing I would just add to it, and I was sort of into what you were saying about semiconductors on the choke point, is it's also different by sector. So semiconductors are a very specific case. But if you think about something like aerospace, actually, the US and the Europeans are sort of heavily competitors with two major suppliers. There's obviously the Chinese emerging. So that's an area where you'll always want to see some degree of competition. On things like rare earths and the more critical minerals and the upstream stuff, actually that's a bit different. The area of competition, there's much more shared interest in having a stable supply. So I think part of this is thinking a little bit sector by sector, issue by issue, about where the balance between competition and full cooperation should lie, and we're really only at the beginning of some of that work. And the work that actually what you've written in your book is incredibly helpful in just flushing out actually some of those areas that policymakers now need to get to.
Do you think that the G7 still has a role? And I'm hoping that you think so, since you're the Sherpa.
Yeah.
But what is the role then? If there's so many challenges from the US on multinational cooperation, what can the G7 do, and what's the role specifically to coordinate supply chain resilience across allies?
So the G7 it's not a formal entity. It's not an international organization with a secretariat and a set of rules, or like the EU, where you've got a whole range of sort of shared and common laws. It is an informal grouping, and that is I actually think that's its strength. It provides a place for private conversation between that group of leaders who literally can fit around a table. If you go to a G20 meeting, the room is 2-3 times the size of this room, and everybody's sitting around there. I mean, you can't have a single conversation with it, whereas in the G7 you can, and that is very important, particularly at times like now, where actually you've got quite a lot of different dynamics across the Atlantic. But underneath that political level, it still provides that forum for just ongoing coordination or cooperation on these complicated emerging policy areas. And my successors and my colleagues in other countries are doing that now. There's work going on what the next phase of Russian sanctions should be. Quite a lot of work going on bits around export control. So that function still exists.
Jonathan, you're not only a Deputy National Security Advisor for the UK government. Previously, you were UK Director at the European Investment Bank, and then also an alternate director at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, both institutions that are designed to mobilize public capital and address long-term structural challenges. Based on that experience, how do you see the UK and more broadly Europe using public financial tools to strengthen these supply chains?
So, I mean, look, that was a long time ago. The EIB is an EU institution, so when I was in that really was a long time ago. But we have seen quite a lot over the last few years in how some of these international institutions, seeing the same with the World Bank, but actually also domestic institutions like the US Development Finance Corporation, all thinking about the role that public money and public finance can bring in leveraging and private finance in some of these complicated areas. The most interesting one, in my view, is actually around the energy transition, where obviously there's a lot of politics around the sort of climate part of it, but actually there's a very heavy energy security piece to that. And I agree, it's interesting what this administration are doing in relation to the acquisitions on, I've forgotten the name of the company, but that company, which I think there is a DFC link to some of, but the last American administration did this work, it's called with the Lobito Corridor, which is this transit line in southern Africa. These are all examples of actually how you can use the balance sheet of public institutions to bring a bit of that sort of national interest in an area where the market otherwise either can't do quite as quickly as it might otherwise, or with the sort of national strategic intent you might need.
Is there a specific instrument or institutional model that you think is best suited to support investment in areas where private sectors are reluctant to lead?
So I can probably sort of talk best to what actually the UK has got. We've got this thing called British Investment International, which actually broadly either provides some shared equity or some or partners in terms of specific types of loans. So we're sort of moving on from a world where it's purely about grant finance, if you like, to see where actually some of these more sort of innovative public sector interventions basically manage that first tranche of risk. And as I say, that's been particularly the case in the energy area, and that's mainly been with a sense of the green transition, but increasingly actually now also seeing that being about also looking at the energy security aspect of that as well.
Eddie, your fantastic book, Choke Points, in it you talk about specific points in global supply chains and how they can become leverage in economic statecraft. We're now seeing that Trump wants to use import tariffs over financial sanctions as a weapon of economic warfare. He's been pushing the EU to impose steep tariffs on China and India to pressure them to stop buying Russian oil. That's just one example. Do you think tariffs are as effective an economic weapon as sanctions?
I'm really glad you asked this, because I think sometimes in the discourse lately, certainly in the US media, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's the same in Europe, there's been confusion about sanctions and tariffs. They're fundamentally different tools. I actually heard this morning Ambassador Whitaker, who much of what he said about Europe buying Russian energy I agreed with, but then he went on to say that the US is imposing sanctions on India, which is actually not true, right? The US has imposed secondary tariffs on India to try to persuade India to stop buying Russian oil. So to back up a second, is this a good idea? When it comes to US financial sanctions, the reason they're so impactful is that they're leveraging an obvious choke point, which is the US dollar. So the US dollar is involved in 90% of all foreign exchange transactions. So if you're cut off from the dollar, if you're an Indian refinery or a big Chinese bank and you no longer have access to the US dollar-based financial system, it's a real serious problem for you, right? We talked about advanced semiconductors, which Commissioner Shevkovich rightly said that both the US and Europe are sitting on different choke points, right? NVIDIA is designing something like 70 or 80% of the AI chips in the world, whereas ASML is producing all of the EUV machines, basically, in the world. So those are clear choke points, right? But when it comes to import tariffs, is that a choke point? I mean, the US actually only accounts for 13% of global imports. So the idea that we can persuade countries around the world to do whatever we want just by imposing tariffs on them, it just isn't really checked out in the numbers. And you actually also heard Commissioner Shevkovich mention this morning that even the EU, which has a massive trade relationship with the US, is only doing 20% of its exports to the United States. So I actually worry that if we're relying on import tariffs instead of these choke points like financial sanctions or export controls, we're not going to have the same success. And the other thing to note is when it comes to Russian oil, the EU is actually taking the alternative approach already, right? So the EU is doing stuff on Russian oil. They've imposed sanctions as recently as July on the second biggest oil refinery in India. They imposed sanctions on 2 Chinese banks. I hear that the 19th sanctions package will include more sanctions on Indian refineries and Chinese banks. I think for the transatlantic partnership to actually succeed in providing the right incentive to stop buying Russian oil, I would prefer to see the EU approach, where we take targeted sanctions, leveraging choke points, against these Indian, Chinese, Emirati, Turkish entities that are involved in the Russian oil trade, instead of blanket import tariffs, which I do not expect will work.
Can you bring your policy experience and talk about that perspective? How do you think governments and industry stakeholders should assess which supply chain choke points, to use your word, present the biggest strategic risks?
So I would sort of loop back to what we were talking about earlier. I think it's clearly choke points where there's a defense dependency, right? So in the U.S., we stopped producing antimony, which you actually need to produce ammunition and shells and all kinds of other things. That's clearly not viable for the United States long term. We need to start producing these things. We need our allies to produce them. But then there's this other category where there's asymmetric dependence that could be weaponized against us. We've talked about rare earths, but that's not the only one. One thing that I really want to bring into the conversation, because Jonathan, I think, rightfully mentioned the IRA and the renewables, the clean energy transition. We are, whether we like it or not, moving into a different energy economy, right? Most of the world is adopting battery technologies, clean technologies. And I'm concerned that we are in the process of ceding the new energy economy to China. Because across the clean energy sector, whether it's the minerals that we've already talked about, batteries, or even electric vehicles, China is dominating all of those sectors. And I don't want us to be at the 15th edition of the Transatlantic Forum on Geoeconomics talking about how did we turn China into the Saudi Arabia of the clean energy economy. And that's a problem that we really urgently need to fix as a transatlantic partnership.
Well, Josh and Julia, Eddie wants to be invited back for the 15th session. Eddie, sticking with you in the context of great power competition, in your book, you talk about an impossible trinity between economic interdependence, economic security, and geopolitical competition.
Yeah.
How should policymakers approach that tension?
Sure. I think this may be the reason I sort of put this framework in my book is I tried to provide an explanation for why we've seen this secular trend in which every single US president of the 21st century, from George W. Bush to Barack Obama to Donald Trump to Joe Biden, has imposed sanctions at roughly twice the rate of their predecessor. And now, according to the IMF, that trend has gone global. If you look at since 2019, global trade restrictions have tripled in just the last 6 years. And it can't just be that Barack Obama and Donald Trump disagree on everything except the fact that sanctions are great. There has to be some sort of structural driver. And so this concept of the geoeconomic impossible trinity, geopolitical competition, economic security, economic interdependence, you can only have 2 out of 3. I think what we see today is we clearly have fierce geopolitical competition, but we also still have the economic interdependence that we embraced in the 1990s. And so what's happened is all of the major powers around the world, the United States, the UK, the European Union, Japan, China, Russia, none of us feel a sense of economic security. And that's why economic security is the buzzword really in all of these capitals. So if this framework is right, there's really 2 ways out of it, right? One way is you get rid of geopolitical competition. We basically come together and say, we no longer view China as a geopolitical rival. We no longer view Russia as a geopolitical rival. We're comfortable with China producing 95% of the rare earth permanent magnets that we depend on. Europe is dependent on, is okay relying on Russian gas. I don't know about those of you guys in the room. That seems kind of fanciful to me. I don't think that's going to happen. And so I think we are going to have to roll back economic interdependence to a certain extent in order to reclaim our sense of economic security. The big question is, what's that going to look like? Is it going to look like autarky, where we all feel like we have to do everything ourselves? Or is it going to look like friendshoring, where the US and Europe roll back some of our interdependence on geopolitical rivals like Russia and China and others, but we actually increase our interdependence with each other? And I think the challenge is, in order to get to that what I consider the more optimal outcome, it's going to take a lot of coordination, and frankly, much more than we have now. And I worry also that because the Trump administration really started off its trade war not just by targeting adversaries, but also by targeting allies, that some of that trust may have been lost. And so I think it's going to take some effort to really build it back up.
There's a feeling around the world that it would be great to just know what it is the US wants, what Trump wants, or what the electorate wants, since it's going, a pendulum is swinging back and forth. But that's also seen as a negotiation tactic from a deal maker president that we have now in the US. How does that affect what you're saying?
Look, uncertainty is really problematic when you're trying to build long-term relationships based on trust. And I heard that even in the last panel, where I think everyone at the end said that the EU-US trade deal is going to look different next year or the year after, right? I think my perception, if I understood Commissioner Shevkovich correctly, was that the EU just wanted some stability, right? They didn't want this to be a protracted trade war because we have bigger fish to fry as a transatlantic partnership. We are dealing with a war on the European continent. We're dealing with an imperialist Russia that's trying to remake basically the world order that we've lived under since 1945. We can't be squabbling as a transatlantic partnership. So I worry that if we are in the process of every 6 to 12 months, reigniting a little trade war with Europe and having to come to another truce, we're never going to get to the point where we can actually deal with the serious security problems that are right at our doorstep.
Let's return to industry. David, the pandemic and the geopolitical shocks that we've seen since since COVID-19 have renewed focus on strategic dependencies in very specific areas: active pharmaceutical ingredients, diagnostic technologies, biotech inputs, other things. There's a broad consensus that there needs to be more resilience. Are there, from your perspective in corporate affairs and experience in government, how do you think that policymakers and industry leaders should evaluate the trade-offs?
I mean, there's an interesting situation we have when we talk about COVID, because actually the semiconductor industry was surprisingly resilient. After 3 months of disruptions, whatever, they got back to normal, and then the 1 to 3 years after that, our company, the Taiwanese companies, they had record sales. So it's the opposite of what we normally perceive when we hear COVID and chip crisis and these words. The chip crisis was an automotive problem. It was an issue with forecasting the demand right. But the semiconductor industry and also other parts of the electronic industry, they were surprisingly resilient because this business continuity is part of the DNA. That's the one thing. I mean, there was already multi-sourcing, there were strong local-to-local strategies in place. And yes, there were learnings, and we had to improve them. We had to, for instance, in our company, we had to develop a digital tool where we really see how the supply chain is working together. So if there's a risk at some end, how does this affect all the other components? And we can also use that for scenario planning. But overall, that resilience was already there. I think the threats, to be fair, are more from the policy side. I think policies have the potential to defragment and to hurt this very sensitive ecosystem much stronger than actually these natural disasters. Yeah.
For each of our panelists, as we wrap up here, we should expect to see supply chain disruptions as a risk for the foreseeable future. What kinds of institutional reforms do you think are going to be best to future-proof the supply chains? Jonathan?
So I don't think there's a sort of single thing. I think what we're trying to do, but what we've tried to do in the UK is sort of go through it a bit sort of end to end. So I think part of this is about having a much better grip on understanding your own supply chains. I think that applies to sovereigns. Actually, it also applies to some companies who've also sort of discovered, if you like, they have areas of dependency that they hadn't realized, even if it's to go back to having a number of suppliers that in the end come back to one. So there's a bit around that, and we set up a supply chain center on that. So I think there is that bit from the sort of the policy framework. There will be bits where governments will need to want to intervene, and I think make this debate on the efficacy of these different levers is one that still in its infancy, and there needs to be more of, and to be. But then I think, and this goes back to my point about being sector by sector, I think there needs to be an area where, as governments, we recognise this is still basically an issue for the market, and then issues where actually sovereigns can step in, and you have to be quite considered about what those latter areas are. So I'd say those are the sort of three things, which is really making sure we understand the dynamics, make sure your toolkits are there if you need to use them, but then actually have a proper framework that enables you to be quite deliberative about where governments may choose. And that goes back to the sort of three pillars that I was talking about at the beginning.
Well, David, actually, if we could hear from you, where do you think governments should step in?
I think one theme we see all over basically the globe is the coherence of measures. So I'll give you one example. We are currently treating semiconductors and AI as different segments. They aren't. Yeah. They're one. AI is basically developing semiconductors and back and forward. You can't separate them. But we have different regulations, and sometimes these regulations contradict. So we need to really think much more in systems and how these things influence each other than doing isolated. I'm looking at this sector and there's a particular policy for that without looking how this is influencing the other things. That is, in terms of policy, in terms of sanctions, in terms of export controls. I think that's the most important thing, to get that coherence in. And the second thing is we see that's a little bit more a European issue. In order to stay agile, you need to be agile. For instance, in Germany, it takes you up to 12 months in order to get a new material granted. So if you want to, diversify your supply chain, while everywhere in the world it takes you a couple of months, 1, 2, 3 months. So we need to bring also speed and pragmatism into that system. So two things: try to perceive and conceive the system, and try to get the coherence in there, and on the other side, increase the speed within that system.
Eddie.
Sure. So two things, and kind of building off both of what Jonathan and David said. So first, I think one of the things that makes economic statecraft so challenging is that government sets the policy, but it's the private sector that implements, right? It's the private sector ultimately that has to freeze assets when it comes to sanctions, or build fabs when it comes to the CHIPS Act, right? It's not the government that's actually doing it ourselves. I think that while it's great that in both the US and Europe, we've had this resurgence of interest in economic statecraft and economic security, we also need to remember that our strength always has been a dynamic private sector. And so what I would hope is that government finds ways to have dialogue with the private sector, because in order to formulate policies that actually get implemented the way that we want them to, we have to take their concerns and their interests on board. So I don't want to see the US and Europe try to out-China China. I think we need to build on our strengths, which is ultimately a dynamic private sector with very light touch, but guided guidance from the state. I think when it comes to institutional reform, Jonathan mentioned US, European, and G7 coordination on Russia sanctions, and I would really laud Jonathan and his colleagues, because they really did do an amazing job in the early part of the war in Ukraine in 2022 to really align incredibly ambitious measures amongst the G7. What I would say, though, is in some ways we got a little bit lucky, right, in that we had early warning that a crisis was coming. In the spring of 2021, already, intelligence in the US and other countries saw that Russia was probably going to invade Ukraine, and we needed to come up with options, right? That almost never happens. And we don't have any organ within the US government that is charged with doing advanced contingency planning, that's sitting around the way that my colleagues at the Pentagon do when it comes to, if China invades Taiwan, God forbid, they have military plans at the ready. We don't have anything like that when it comes to economic statecraft in the United States. I think what we need to do in the US is we need really top to bottom institutional reform in terms of how we do economic statecraft, how we take some of the tools that you talked about, whether it's sanctions, industrial policy, export controls, tariffs, and bring them into a coordinated mechanism, whether that's more robust coordination in the interagency, whether that's a whole new government department, which some governments have done. I think that that's ultimately what's going to be needed to get the coherence, frankly, that David mentioned in his remarks.
Well, I want to thank our panelists. It's been a fantastic discussion. For those who are watching virtually, we'll be back soon. And for everyone who's here, there are coffee and refreshments behind you. Thank you.
Thank you.